Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm talking with Tom Holland, the historian, not the actor who plays Spider-Man. Every time I post about this interview, Tom, everyone's saying, "Are you interviewing Spider-Man?" I'm sure you get that a lot. It must be frustrating.
Do you know, you're not the first person to ask that question. I've I could because I've been on Twitter longer than the other Tom Holland has had his career as Spider-Man, so I've seen it gradually kind of creep up on me.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
and I remember when he got the part of Spider-Man, and I thought, well, I might as well just get off the internet now because everyone's going to mistake me for Spider-Man, and so it goes on. So apologies to your listeners that I'm not Spider-Man. Very,
Yeah,
very sorry.
not
Nothing I
Spider-Man,
can
but
do
we are
about it.
talking we are talking about a really cool book that you wrote fairly recently called Dominion, which is actually linked in the description of this video. And the subtitle is The Making of the Western Mind, where you argue that Christianity is kind of the backbone or the source of science, secularism, liberalism, and a lot of our Western values and ideals. And so, just a little about Tom, if you haven't heard about him. He's an award winning historian, author, and broadcaster. Holland has penned outstanding popular histories of the Greco Persian Wars. Persian Fire is that book, and the Fall of the Roman Republic. That's titled Rubicon. The core argument of Holland's latest book, though, Dominion, which I showed on the screen, which you can see, it's really, really thick. The
Could
core
be a lot
argument here,
thicker, I
though,
can tell you.
it could have been.
Oh yes,
Well,
oh yes.
the core idea here is that that our contemporary Western moral and social norms are the product of the Christian revolution of the mind. The Greeks and Romans are, in ethical terms, as remote from us as giant lizards, as one person put it in a review of your book. So I'm really excited about this, and a lot of people don't want to accept that Christianity is the sort of ground or root source of a lot of our ideals as Westerners. But nevertheless, I think that you're right. Well, let's just get into it. So you no longer identify as a Christian, Tom. So what inspired you to write a book about Christianity's influence on Western culture?
Well, actually, I have come to identify as a Christian, because I think that in terms of my values, in terms of my assumptions, in terms of my morals, I don't really see what else I can describe myself as. But you're right. That is something that does make lots of people uncomfortable, and it's certainly something that I would have denied, um, 10, certainly 20 years ago, because although I was raised a Christian, I lost my faith fairly early. To begin with, that was it was to do with dinosaurs, which I was obsessed with, as lots of little boys are. Um, and I couldn't square the biblical narrative in Genesis with the fact that dinosaurs existed. So it was a kind of very Victorian crisis of faith. Um, but then also, I became increasingly obsessed by ancient Greece and Rome, and I just found the Greek gods kind of more interesting and sassy and more charismatic. And so I came to identify myself with the Greek and the Roman heritage, and that was really the long term the focus of my interest. And I wrote a series of books about it. Um, but the more I did that, the more I came to feel that the Greeks and the Romans were very alien to us. And you kind of mentioned somebody comparing them to giant lizards. I mean, they kind of are the tyrannosaurs. They're the the Romans in particular, the kind of the apex predators of antiquity. Great white sharks, Siberian tigers. And although they're fascinating, you wouldn't really want a tyrannosaur or a Siberian tiger in the house with you. And the more I reflected on the Roman world, the Greek world, the stranger they came to seem. And it's not just in terms of values, it's also in the most kind of fundamental way. Things like attitudes to sex, attitudes to gender, attitudes to society, all kinds of things we take for granted. I came to realize they're actually simply not present in the pre-Christian world. And so I became more and more alert to the fact that there'd been this great process of change. And I came to realize that actually what had channeled and provided the impetus for this process of change was Christianity itself. But that Christianity isn't a kind of static thing. It's not a monolithic structure that simply exists. It's incredibly fluid. It's evolving all the time. And I come to see that as being pretty essential to what Christianity is about. And so it's in that sense that I would say that I'm Christian because I am the product of 2,000 years of that evolutionary process. And it's not just me. I think that in the fundamentals, pretty much everything about the West is so saturated in Christian assumptions that it's almost impossible not to see it, even now, as being fundamentally Christian.
So one thing I've got to ask is, well, first of all, I want to talk about how beautiful your background is, because I have a lot of people on my show.
Thank you.
And most people don't have such a beautiful background. And even the light that's coming up from above, and it's just beautiful. So the question I have is, do you have any dinosaurs on your bookshelf?
I certainly do. I've got a little one here. Where can I put it there? So a little fluffy one.
What is your favorite dinosaur?
Well, a stegosaur. I don't have a stegosaur, but I do have...
Guys, I didn't anticipate doing this.
Okay. Well, you asked. So I've got, of course, a sauropod. Everyone loves a sauropod.
I think that's my daughter's favorite.
Exciting. This is very exciting. Can you see?
Here, let me put you on the full screen. There you go.
Okay. So what is that? This looks like just a lump of rock. This is the bone marrow of a sauropod, which I picked up a couple of years ago when I was in Wyoming, out in the Badlands, and we went to a fossil site, and that just was kind of lying there on the ground.
Oh my gosh!
So it's literally, if you look at the sauropod's leg, this is kind of the inside of the sauropod's leg. So you asked, and there it is.
Yes, I was going to say Stegosaurus is my favorite, and my kids can't understand it. I'm like, it's the best dinosaur. It just is.
Clearly, it's
clearly
definitely the best dinosaur. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, so
and I was out in Wyoming with one of the world experts on stegosaurs, so it was a great privilege. And actually,
gosh, that sounds awesome.
Dinosaur prospecting in the Badlands of the Wild West provides one of the chapters in Dominion, because I couldn't not have dinosaurs in the book.
Well, I want to talk about someone who's sort of similar. Tim, have you heard of a guy named Tim O'Neill? He's
yes, Australian History for Atheists.
Yes. So he posted a review of Dominion on his blog. I don't know if you've read it, but he draws a few similarities between the two of you. And like you, he sort of abandoned his faith when he was younger, and now, since he's kind of defending Christianity in various ways on his blog, he basically combats the sort of atheist, not atheist. These aren't atheist arguments, but like Jesus mythicism. He combats a lot of this stuff on his blog and everything. So he gets accused all the time of being a Christian apologist. So the question I have is, do you ever get accused of being a Christian apologist?
Well, I wouldn't take it as an accusation. I mean, if that's how people interpret it, that's fine. The argument of the book is that our understanding of what is good and bad are essentially Christian ones, and there are very different ways of understanding it. And I think that the atheism of the more, let's call it, evangelical kind, so the Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris kind, is itself, I think, fundamentally Christian. And the reason for that is that a contempt for superstition, a desire to topple idols, a conviction that people who walk in darkness should be brought into light, and that if they're brought into light, they will thereby be saved from the demons of darkness, of course, is a fundamentally Christian one. I mean, it goes back before Christianity to the Hebrew prophets, where Isaiah or Jeremiah are essentially telling the Egyptians or the Babylonians that what they worship, isn't true, and that there is nothing divine about, say, springs or fountains or woods. And that's a tradition that gets inherited by Christian missionaries. So when You have missionaries going into the dripping woods of Saxony in the early Middle Ages. Those Christian missionaries are absolutely convinced that the gods worshipped by what they call pagans are simply not true. And then, of course, going into the Reformation, Protestants are similarly contemptuous of what they see as the superstition and the idolatry of Catholics. And really, all that modern atheism is doing is applying and aiming those assumptions at the fabric of Christianity itself. And if you are telling someone that there's nothing divine about a spring, it's a kind of logical progress to end up telling people that there's no God anywhere. And I think that the kind of moral fervor that the more militant brand of atheists bring to their beliefs is deeply Christian. I mean, why the assumption that telling people that there's no God, why is it important? Why do they think it matters? They think it matters because they are the heirs of the Christian assumption that this message matters and is important.
So I want to get into the topic of science, and we'll get to secularism in just a second. But so what is your basic argument for the claim that science is rooted in Christianity or has Christian roots?
One of the things that made me want to write Dominion was the discovery that writing in English, there were so many words. I mean, if you imagine a word as a kind of sponge and you dip it into a bath, so many words in the English language have been dipped into the bath of Christianity, and they're absolutely saturated with it. And science is one of those words. Science, in the sense that we use it now, really only takes on the current signification in the second half of the 19th century. The category doesn't exist before that. So to talk about, Greek science or Chinese science or Egyptian science is completely anachronistic. It's like saying that Julius Caesar invaded and conquered France. You kind of get the point, but it's not accurate. So where does our modern idea of science come from? Well, it clearly, again, it's all about evolution, and it surprises me that say evolutionary biologists are so often hostile to the idea that they themselves might be descended from a very contingent series of beliefs. The sciences, it means knowing in Latin. You can trace the evolution of what we call science back through the Enlightenment, back through the early modern period to the Middle Ages. And essentially, the study of science begins in the medieval universities. And the universities are very novel institutions when they're founded in the 12th century. And they are committed to the idea that God's law can be fathomed. So you have all kinds of lawyers who are fashioning what comes to be called canon law. But at the same time, you have people who apply the assumption that if God has given laws and it's structured then to human beings, then he must also have structured the cosmos with laws. So there is a single source, a single origin point for the laws that govern the cosmos. And human beings can hope to fathom these laws because the evidence of Scripture is that God is willing to submit himself to the idea of covenants. So there's the covenant that the children of Israel have with God, and then there's the second covenant that is that St. Paul announces. So although scholars in the medieval universities are of course entirely content to acknowledge that miracles are possible, that nothing is beyond God, that he can suspend the laws of the cosmos if he wants, nevertheless there is this kind of guiding assumption that an all-powerful God has nevertheless allowed the cosmos to be structured by laws, and therefore it's possible, because human beings are created in the image of God and therefore have been endowed with a spark of divine reason, it's possible for them to fathom these laws. And that is the kind of ideological framework within which scholars in the Middle Ages look at the what they call natural philosophy, the functioning of animals, of minerals, of the cosmos, of the stars, of the planets, and so on. And it's this tradition that then feeds into what is conventionally called the scientific revolution of the late 16th, 17th century, but I think yeah, for reasons I've explained, that's an anachronistic term, and then feeds ultimately into the 19th century, at which point science is defined essentially as being what is a form of knowledge that is not religion. So in a sense, science is defined by religion as its negative, as its opposite. And that's why you have in the late 19th century this idea that science and religion are kind of fundamentally opposed. But that is a notion that rather like atheism in the kind of modern Anglo-American form, emerges in England and America as a very Protestant way of seeing the world. And an awful lot of this narrative that there's been a kind of timeless battle between science and religion reaching back through time is basically sublimated anti-Catholicism. So you still get this stuff, and this is the kind of thing that Tim O'Neill is always banging on about, the idea that there was something called science in, say, antiquity that the Greeks had, and it was there was science in the Library of Alexandria, and then the Christians burned it down because of religion. And if only they hadn't done it, we'd have had great science all the way through the Middle Ages, and we'd probably invented space rockets, and we'd be on Alpha Centauri by now. And this is a myth, because without Christianity, we would not have science. And
this is actually a perfect set, because I was going to ask you, there's a difference between saying something like Christianity is the source of our scientific knowledge or our doing science, and then even beyond that, secularism and just our Western values more broadly. There's a way you can make that argument, but a related claim, but distinctly different, is a counterfactual one, which you just gave, which is to say, if Christianity were false, if Christianity never happened, would we then still get science, or would we still get these values in some other way? And I think that's a little bit more difficult to argue. So how do you establish that?
Well, because I think that you have to ask yourself, why does science emerge in a specifically Christian context? Is this just a coincidence? Is science something that kind of floats around like a gas that anyone can get hold of? So at one point, the Greeks have science, the Chinese have science, the Arabs have science, and then it's the turn of the Christians to have science. I think that's a profoundly ahistorical way of working out how culture works. Culture is contingent. Culture kind of emerges as a result of a confluence of all kinds of influences and determinants. And so I think, you say, what is it about Christian society that makes it possible? And I think it's this kind of Goldilocks quality of the Christian God, because if you look at, say, the Muslim God basically, for the emergence of science, is too powerful. The Muslim God does not bind himself with laws. The Muslim God does not have an equivalent of covenants. The assumption among Muslim scholars is that if you drop an apple from a tree, it's not because there is a law that says that the apple must drop from the tree. It's because God is intervening to ensure every time that the apple drops from the tree, because to say otherwise would to limit God's power. So in a sense, the impetus for Muslim scholars to try and identify universal laws in the way that you get with ultimately culminating in Newtonian physics is simply not there. Conversely, if you look at the Confucian world, you don't have this sense of a kind of prime mover who structures the universe with laws. You have a sense that the cosmos is made up of all kinds of different elements that interact with one another in a kind of constantly evolving and fluid way. And the measure for that, which I include in Dominion, is the story of how the Jesuits go to Beijing in the late 16th and early 17th century. And the Jesuits go there as people who are completely au fait with the latest developments in European astronomy. Many of the Jesuits who end up in China are close associates with Galileo. They are familiar with Galileo's telescope. They're absolutely at the cutting edge. And what they find when they get to Beijing is that their understanding of how the cosmos works enables them to predict eclipses much more effectively than the mandarins at the emperor's court. And this is incredibly important because the emperor, for ideological reasons, needs to know when there are going to be eclipses, because it's his role to kind of mediate between the heavens and the earth. But the Confucian scholars are essentially unable to replicate the calculations that the Jesuit scholars are making unless they convert to Christianity. So there's a famous Chinese scholar who converts to Christianity and who essentially masters the Jesuit understanding of astronomy. But unless you have that kind of Christian idea that there's a framework of laws and that there's a kind of, these laws are universal throughout the fabric of the cosmos, it's very difficult to make sense of this revolution that is happening in the understanding of astronomy in 17th century Europe. So again, if you don't get science in China, you don't get science in the Islamic world for those reasons. You get science in the Christian world because you have that kind of Goldilocks state. The God is all powerful, but he is willing to submit himself to laws. You kind of need that before you can have something that will evolve to become what in the 19th century can be defined as science with a capital S.
So I know that you could actually argue that scientific knowledge is a kind of value, but I want to talk about moral values. And so this is all related to secularism and liberalism. So why do you think that our Western values are rooted in Christianity? And before you answer, I want to let the audience know that we're about to turn to audience questions. So if you have a question for Tom, then leave it in the live chat. If you send it as a super chat, that's the best way to make sure that your question will be asked and answered today. I don't think I saw one earlier that popped up, but anyways, just to let you know, that's the best way to make sure that your question gets asked and answered today. So yeah, back to this question. Why do you think that our moral values are rooted in Christianity, regardless of, if you're an atheist or whatever? Why do you think that?
Well, you mentioned secularism, the idea of the secular. And secular, like science, is a word that is often used anachronistically. So you may read a book on, secular values in Greece. If you get a textbook on Greece, you will have a book in which they talk about democracy and the economy, and then they might have one on religion. And it's a separate chapter. And there's this idea that you can separate something called religion off from something that is called the secular. And it's assumed by most people in the West, I think, that this is just, a given. This is just automatic way of understanding the world. Of course, something called the secular exists, but it doesn't. Secular, like science, is absolutely rooted in the seedbed of Christian theology and its evolution over the course of the centuries. And in fact, more than that, the idea of the secular is distinctive to the Latin Western form of Christianity. And essentially, you can kind of pin the origins of it to something that has quite a topical ring at the moment, for you in America, because in 410 Rome is sacked by the Goths, and everyone in the Roman world is completely shocked by this. And those Romans who are not Christian say, well, this is proof that we should never have abandoned the worship of the gods, because traditionally, classically, the Roman understanding of the role of the gods is that they're a kind of insurance policy. And you take out an insurance policy, which they call a religio, which is literally something that binds you to a god. It could be a sacrifice, it could be a feast day, something like that. And you pay the gods this religio, and then the gods will look after you. So clearly, the fact that Rome has been sacked, this shows that abandoning these religiones was a bad thing. This prompts the greatest theologian in the Latin West, Augustine, a bishop in North Africa, to come up with a decisive riposte. And Augustine's riposte is to say there is only one religio, and this religio, which is the religio of the Christian Church, joins human beings to the only source of eternity, which is that of heaven. Against that, everything, human life, the Roman Empire, the whole of mortal civilization, is part of the saeculum, And the cyclum, essentially, it's the span of living memory. So it comes for Augustine, it effectively means the flux of things that everything in the fallen world is a part of. And so he comes up with this incredibly potent counterpointing of the dimension of the cyclum, that of the fallen world, which is endless birth and decay, and that of religio, which joins fallen humanity to the eternity of heaven. And over the course of the centuries, this beds itself down into the very fabric of European society in the West, in Latin Christendom. And by the Middle Ages, it's kind of been weaponized by the Roman Church. And it establishes this assumption that there are two dimensions. There's the dimension of what comes to be called the secular, which is separate from the church. And then there's the dimension of the church, which is that of religion. And by the 18th century, so after the Reformation, which kind of moves on from the medieval idea that there's a kind of particular dimension of religio which is specific to specialists in it, so monks or friars or nuns or whatever, the Protestant Reformation democratizes that idea, and you come to have the idea that everyone has a religion. So you have that sense that a religion is what an individual believes in, and what a personal relationship with God. But it's combined with this idea that religion is something that is separate from what is coming to be called the secular. And this is an assumption and an understanding of how the world should be structured that Europeans in the age of imperial expansion then export to the rest of the world. So when the British go to India, which is what they call Hindustan, where the Hindus live, the Indians, these Protestant British administrators look around and they say, well, what's the religion of the Hindus? And it's a ridiculous question, because Hindus don't have religion, because that's an entirely Protestant way of seeing the world. But the British, because they are the rulers of India, and because English is enshrined as the lingua franca across the British Raj, in time, the Indians themselves come to absorb this assumption that there's something called the secular and there are things called religions. And when in 1947 the British leave, the constitution of the Indian Republic says that it's a secular republic. It's an incredibly Christian idea. And in Dominion, I quote an Indian scholar who says that Christianization proceeds in two ways: through conversion, which is obvious, but also through secularization. And I think that what we saw last year in the summer of 2020 was the fact that non-Christian civilizations, as Western power retreats, are waking up to the fact that actually there's nothing neutral about the secular. So Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is very, very keen basically to banish the idea of the secular, to restore India to Hindutva, to the idea that there is a kind of primal way of being Indian, which of course he associates with the religion that we would call Hinduism. But I think that Modi would not accept that Hinduism is a religion. He would say that it's simply a word that conveys the totality of what Indian experience and society and life and culture and civilization should properly be. And you see a similar thing in Istanbul, where President Erdogan of Turkey converted what had been the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, which had then become a mosque when Constantinople was conquered. Then with Ataturk, who establishes Turkey as a secular republic, he turns Hagia Sophia into a museum. This summer, Erdogan converted that museum back into a mosque.
Well, sorry about the little technical glitch that we had, everybody. We are back. And so, Tom, if you can remember where you left off, otherwise, I just wanted to remind everyone that we're going to switch to Q&A from the audience. And I wanted to switch to that a little bit sooner than I normally do, because I want to give as much time to you guys to ask Tom any of your questions. So unless, Tom, you wanted to fill in something, if you remember where you were at.
Yeah, I just really to say that the idea that the secular is a neutral concept is a very bogus one. It's shot through with Christian assumptions, and that's why people from different civilizational traditions who come to Western states that identify themselves as secular essentially have to shape and mold themselves to a Christian understanding of religions. So you see that with Jews in the 19th century And you see it now with Muslims particularly, and I think it's very much been in the news over the past year in France, particularly because France is the most militantly secular state probably in the world. And that imposes huge strains on Muslims, much greater strains than it does on Catholics, because the idea of the secular actually emerges from the kind of the womb of Catholicism. And so it's much more difficult for Muslims to adapt themselves to the idea of the secular than it is, say, for Catholics.
All right, so we did get some super chats in, and let me go ahead and pull that one up now, and I'll read it on the screen. You should be able to see it on your screen as well, Tom. He says, Dr. Holland, how compelled are you personally by the resurrection of Jesus as a historian? What would convince you to give your life to him as Lord?
Well, that's a question that it's been almost impossible for me not to ponder over the course of the past few years as I've been tracing the history of Christianity and reading the writings of this succession of people in different periods whose entire lives were shaped by it. The problem that I have remains the dinosaur one, that whenever I think about the vast sweep of time and the vast reaches of space, I think, is it really possible that the entire pivot of the cosmos is to be found at this kind of particular moment, the death and supposedly the resurrection of one individual in a tiny corner of the world, when set against the vastness of space and time. And that's always where I fall down. However, having said that, the place that I'm at the moment is that I recognize that the beliefs that I have, for instance, in the inherent dignity of human beings, the inherent equality of human beings, the idea that human beings have rights, that these require a leap of faith. They're not self-evident. They're beliefs that I have to accept that they're beliefs, and realizing as I now do that they are essentially blooms from the kind of the great rose tree of Christianity. I wonder whether it's not, in a sense, I'm kind of on the first rung of a ladder that will lead me to accepting beliefs that the original beliefs that have animated them. I would very much like to believe. Maybe I will overcome the dinosaur problem at some point in the future. And certainly there are times, Christmas being one, Easter being another. There are times when I go to certain places that I find that I'm kind of very sensitive to what are it called, thin places where people feel that the divine is kind of very close to the human. I find myself, I think perhaps because I'm very moved by things that happened in the past, churches that are very old, obviously much easier this side of the Atlantic than on your side of the Atlantic. There I feel a kind of sense of the sublime, a sense of the transcendent, a sense of the mysterious. And I wonder, is this, maybe this is the spirit, the first stirrings of the spirit. So I don't know is the answer, but I think I will know it when and if I feel it.
That is so honest to me, the way that you answered that. I actually want to get clear on what your hang up is, because you mentioned it briefly, but I couldn't really get my mind around it. What is your main hang up?
Well, if Christianity is true, then in a sense, the resurrection constitutes the kind of axle around which the wheel of eternity revolves. It's the moment where everything changes. So as a myth, and I don't use myth as a pejorative, I'm kind of very influenced by the idea that Tolkien has that myths can be true, but it's still I think a myth. That how is that idea that something that happened in a specific place at a specific time, 2,000 years ago, it seems long from our perspective, but it's a blink of the eye compared to the vast reaches of time that precedes it. where how is that idea that there was, a great transformation, a great rupture in the fabric of space and time at that specific moment, how does that relate to the history of the world, to the formation of the planet, to the emergence of life, to the cycles of evolution and extinction that have punctuated the vast reaches of time? And that's why, interestingly, we begun talking about dinosaurs, because really that's has always been the problem for me. And I don't really see a way yet entirely to get past that problem.
Yeah, I think
that, I feel myself to be Christian in terms of morals, in terms of values, and to be Christian in terms of my openness to myth. I am moved very strongly and powerfully by the narratives that I think essentially is the way that Christianity has propagated itself. I don't think that fundamentally Christianity has propagated itself as a kind of framework of strictures or laws or even beliefs. I think it propagates itself through the potency of the stories that are told both in the fabric of both in the narratives of the various books of the Bible, but also are told by Christ himself. I think Christ is the greatest short storyteller of all time, measured simply in terms of his impact, because those stories, those parables, those narratives continue to have a measurable impact on the way that the world functions today, beyond anything else that any other stories that have ever been told. And I feel the truth of those stories. And is that belief? Maybe in a way it is.
So I think I've got a way of explaining what your hang up is, and tell me if you think this is wrong. So it sounds to me like it kind of, Christianity makes sense from a human perspective, from humanity, maybe. I don't know if that's what you're arguing, but I think this is the hang up, is that there are other things that just seem unlikely or unexpected, or just kind of, they don't really fit with the Christian narrative, like dinosaurs, like the vastness of space. So when you're looking out at the world, you've got some things that line up with Christianity, the truth of Christianity, but then there's these other things that just seem really strange and just weird. They don't really fit. There was actually an analogy the other day that I interviewed two different philosophers on a paper that they wrote about aliens and whether or not aliens would invalidate the truth of Christianity. And I think it's kind of along the same lines. Is like, here's the analogy that they gave in their paper. Is imagine if you're watching Shawshank Redemption. Have you watched that movie? Have you seen that movie?
Yeah.
You don't have to. Yeah. Well, okay. So imagine at the end, the climax of the movie, just aliens show up randomly, and that would just be weird. Like that. Why that wouldn't really be something that you would expect if this movie, the movie, like nothing was leading up to that. So it just doesn't really fit with the narrative. It's kind of like an overarching. It just doesn't fit. Doesn't fit into the story. So I think that might be. Is that? Do you think that's an accurate way of describing what your hangup is?
I suppose, but it's more that humans are so tiny, and Christianity gives such a value to humans. We are created in the image of God. Our story is expressive of God's purpose, and Christ dies for humanity, and that death serves to set time on a new framework. But isn't this perhaps just massive presumption? Where how does this story relate to trilobites? Or where was Christ when the meteor smashed into the Yucatan and wiped out the dinosaurs? How do those fit in? And there's a further problem, which is I do feel the potency and the power of the Christian story and the mythic potency of it. But I think that a crucial part of why I feel that power is because I've been raised in a Christian society, and I've been, as I've been talking about, I've been saturated in its assumptions. Now, surely that gives me a kind of inbuilt advantage, doesn't it? So what about Jews or Muslims or Hindus? Why are they not saved? Why is Christianity true when they, someone who's born to Jewish or Muslim or Hindu parents are just as likely to be raised in that tradition and to feel that what they've been taught is natural, So that's the other big problem that I have. That's the other
Okay.
kind of fence that I need to jump.
Well, maybe you and I can talk about that later. Let's get to some more questions. There's a question here from Finding Truth. He says, in your book, you describe the person of Jesus and the greatest message ever told. Can you say something about the person of Jesus and his story?
Well, I had the huge fortune in writing the book that, for the purposes of the history that I was writing, I didn't need actually to arrive at an opinion on what the relationship of the Gospels to the historical Jesus might have been. And my answer to that is, ultimately, I don't think it greatly matters, because let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Jesus didn't exist. That's the kind of mythicist position that is the kind of most extreme atheist position, and that it was all made up, and that nothing in the Gospels is remotely true. Now, if that's true, then the Gospels are truly miraculous, because the gig that you would have to give the Gospel writers is, they'd say, okay, I want you to portray a man who is also God, and I want you to do it in such a way that his life and death are completely going to upend the assumptions of the empire into which he was born, and the portrayal of this man, who is also simultaneously a god, has to be so convincing that it will be accepted by people across the globe in continents that you, the Gospel writers, have never even heard of. And it's still going to be being read and believed in 2,000 years' time. There you go. And if one person had been able to come up with that, that would be astonishing. But for four to come up with it seems to me to be kind of beyond the bounds of belief. So I think that the miracle, what is miraculous about the figure of Jesus, is implicit in the Gospel portrayal of him. And whether you are a believer or not, the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospels is the most astonishing literary feat, I think, in the whole field of literature. There is no figure like him. And he is a convincing portrayal of a man who is a god, and there is nothing like him. There is nothing like him in the field of literature, or the field of belief. And there's a section in Dominion where I try and articulate that, what it is about Jesus that Jesus as portrayed in the Gospels that is so kind of haunting and enigmatic and strange and appealing. And I try to do it in a kind of paragraph. And if you want to know what I think about Jesus, that paragraph at the end of chapter 3 in Dominion, it's my attempt to sum up what is so strange about Jesus, about the figure of Jesus. And I think one thing I'd say about that not just Jesus, but the whole beginnings of Christianity, is that I think that whether you're a believer or not, we as a society have become desensitized to just how strange the story is, how strange the figure of Jesus in the Gospels is, how strange the idea that someone who suffered the worst of deaths, the most shameful of deaths, could somehow have been divine. These are such strange ideas that, again, one of the ambitions I had for Dominion was to try and open people's eyes to the sheer weirdness of it, because only then do you understand what was truly revolutionary about it.
Okay, I've got another question lined up from Gina M. She says, from your perspective, what would you recommend to Christians in Europe trying to reach their secular friends? And what do Christians there need to be doing that they're not doing now?
Well, I think there's a problem for Christians in Europe, and indeed increasingly in America, which is that basically Christianity is won, because the assumptions of liberals, of humanists, of secularists are so Christian that basically everyone just takes kind of Christian teachings, Christian assumptions for granted. So therefore, it becomes a problem for Christians because what is it? What is there that they're saying that's distinctive? And my feeling, which has been really sharpened over the course of the pandemic, is that Christians need to emphasize aspects of the Christian story that many of them, I think, find embarrassing, and that's namely the kind of weird stuff, because the hospitals that we have now in the West, the fact that the state is paying for hospitals and for care, and the assumption that is kind of hardwired into the welfare states across the Western world that the sick should be cared for and those who are suffering should be prioritized. So we've got this the vaccination rollout. The people who are getting the vaccine first are those who are the most vulnerable, the oldest, the sickest. That's an absolute expression of a Christian assumption that would have been completely weird to the pre-Christian world. Strength is the measure of value, not weakness. But that's been kind of secularized. It's something that is just taken for granted. So what is there for Christians to do? I think that Christians, rather than trying to accommodate themselves to skepticism, to atheism, to secularism, rather than trying to find the lowest common denominator, should do the opposite, should emphasize what is strange. Because, speaking as someone who is very drawn to Christianity, what appeals to me about it is that it offers explanations for values and assumptions I have that I can offer no objective rationale for. Why do I think that all human beings are created equal? It's not because objectively, scientifically, coldly, there is anything valuable about human beings at all. The reason I think that is because I'm the heir to a tradition that ultimately derives from Jewish scripture, the idea that God creates human beings in His image, and which is a staggering concept. It's gives to human beings an incredible dignity. And then, in my case, as someone who's a product of a Christian rather than a Jewish upbringing, it's mediated by the New Testament, and I guess summed up by Paul's idea that that there is no Jew or Greek in Christ, that there's no man or woman, that there's no slave or free, that there's a kind of fundamental equality there. And why does Paul think that? Well, Paul thinks that because of the story of Christ, because of his death, because of his resurrection, because Christ rules in heaven. So it's fundamentally supernatural. It's not rational. It's rooted in everything that is strange and bizarre and weird in the Christian story. And when you read Paul's letters, which are the earliest texts, earliest Christian documents that we have, what you have there is a sense of a man who's overwhelmed by the sheer strangeness of what he's talking about. He everything he's saying, he's aware it's strange. He's endlessly saying people are going to think this is madness. People are going to think this is lunacy. Jews are going to think this is a stumbling block. The Gentiles are going to think I'm a lunatic. The strangeness of it is the point. And if Christians don't emphasize the strangeness, then what's the point of them? Because we already have all the teachings. We have the care for the weak and the sick and everything. That's part of what everyone takes for granted. I was looking at
the live chat. This is related. So I was looking at the live chat, people just commenting and everything, and they were saying, so I mean, it seems like if you're already sort of embedded in this culture, you're already going to have a lot of these ideals, and this is something that you argue in the book. So how would you emphasize the weirdness of it if you're already sort of here and you already have these beliefs?
Because okay, so I'll tell you a time where it really cut through to me in the pandemic, and many of you out there may have watched it as well. And I've talked about this quite a lot, but I'll bring it up again because I did think it was kind of very powerful. In Rome, the Pope held an open air mass at St. Peter's Square, and it had to be socially distant, so it was just him basically alone in St. Peter's Square. And you could hear in the background the wailing of sirens, ambulances taking the sick to hospital, and there were clanging of bells sounding out over Rome. And the Pope went to pray before an icon, And this icon had been sent from Constantinople. It showed Madonna and Child, and it had been sent to Rome in the pontificate of Gregory the Great. Gregory was Pope in the 6th century, and he became Pope at a time of plague. And he, like the current Pope, was in Rome at a time where there was a pandemic raging. And the story goes that the Pope that Gregory prays, and Saint Michael is seen, and he sheathes his sword. This is a medieval legend that emerges much later. It's not contemporaneous with Gregory himself, but it articulates this idea that the pandemic and human suffering and the fact that these terrible things happen is a part of a kind of cosmic drama involving angels, presumably demons as well, space and time. We're joined across the centuries with those who've gone before, those who will come after us. And Gregory himself wrote a famous commentary on the Book of Job, and the Book of Job is I guess the most existential book in the Bible, the book that wrestles most profoundly with the question of why, if God is all powerful and all good, why do terrible things happen? And actually, as far as I can tell, the Book of Job doesn't really provide an answer to that. But the power of it is so immense that you read it and you feel there is a kind of answer here. And that answer, it seems to me, is not just implicit within the pages of Job, or indeed within the pages of Scripture, but is manifest through the way in which, over the course of the centuries and the millennia, Christians have understood that and have behaved and have looked back, and presumably are kind of looking forwards. And in a way that kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, about the nature of time. The mystery of Christianity is that it dissolves time. For God, everything is, past, future, present are kind of all as one. And it situates us as human beings, fallen human beings, in a world of suffering and horror, as being a part of that drama. We're situated within that drama. And I think that ultimately that it's in that the reassurance lies. And I think that the role of the churches in this kind of terrible time is to articulate that understanding. It's not really to give public health messages, because we have governments to do that. We have health officials, we have epidemiologists to do that. The role of the churches must be to articulate something profounder than that, to say that we are part of this cosmic drama, that Earth is reflected in heaven and vice versa, and to articulate that in ways that is true to the biblical inheritance and to the inheritance of all the many Christians, the many different ways of understanding Christianity that have evolved over the course of the past 2 millennia, I think. And I think that Christians saying the best way to explain Christianity to those who are not Christian is to pretend that we're basically the same. Well, I think that's too true. I think that's too dangerous, because basically you are the same. So you need to emphasize what's different, what Christianity can provide that secular liberalism can't. And I think that what Christianity can provide is explanations for what secularists believe in that is founded in the dimension of the supernatural. And without that, it's not true, as Paul recognized and said.
Tom, I feel like we could talk for another 3 or 4 hours just about everything. And but unfortunately, you've got to go. You've got deadlines to meet. So I just wanted to thank you for coming on to Capturing Christianity. Is there anything that you'd like to leave with the audience before you go today?
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for having me on, and I hope
buy the book.
In these, yeah, buy the book, of course. I hope that in these troubled times, perhaps you'll find, as I have done, that Christian teachings, Christian myths, Christian stories have a kind of a potency and a saliency that I think they haven't had previously. For me personally, I think that over the past, well, really since the time of the war, people in the West have had it easy. Maybe we've grown a bit soft, and it's staring death and suffering in the face that brings home to you, certainly brings home to me, why it is that Christianity is the single most successful explanation for what humanity's purpose is in the cosmos that has ever emerged. And whether you're a believer or not, it provides an enormous resource for making sense of the world's current experience of suffering. So who knows? I certainly, for me, it's kind of sharpened my appreciation of what Christianity is and what it does.
Well, that was beautiful. And I wanted to say that if you read this book, it's almost like you're reading a movie. Almost the way that you write this is very, very entertaining. It's a book that's actually kind of difficult to put down once you start to get into it. It's just, I highly, highly, highly recommend picking it up. Like I mentioned several times throughout this interview, I'll mention it one last time. I've got it linked in the description of this video if you're interested in picking it up. Because it's so big, I think in Amazon it's about $22 right now, US. So it's a little bit more than like a standard apologetics book, like a popular level book. I think they're normally around 10, but this one, because it's so thick, it's got so much information in it, it's a little bit more expensive. But I think it's worth picking up. And I mean, it seemed like you wanted to say something about that.
The paperback version you got there is the British one. And the American one, which I think is really interesting, the difference between Britain and America, that in Britain, the subtitle you read out, The Making of the Western Mind, is one that my editor in Britain came up with, because he thought that too much mention of Christianity would put readers off. Whereas in America, the subtitle is How the Christian Revolution Changed the World, which is different. And I think in the States, the paperback is coming out in the next couple of months.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. All right. Well, like I said, thank you for coming on, and maybe we can do something else in the future. I was listening to your debate with AC Grayling on Unbelievable. That was pretty interesting. I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts about that one as well. But like I said, we'll have to talk later. So thanks again for coming.
Some other time. It would be a pleasure. Thanks ever so much. Thanks a lot.
Okay. See you later. All right. I'll talk to the audience just for a second. So thank you guys for tuning in today. This interview with Tom was really, really cool. Obviously, I would have loved to talk to him a lot more. I think you guys would love to be able to ask him some more questions. But good thing is that you can go pick up his book and read it. It's I highly, highly recommend it. There's a lot of people that have read it and also recommend it. There's a really cool review that I was reading earlier today that Tim Keller actually put out. Obviously, he's a very, very well-read pastor. If you don't know who he is, look him up. Tim Keller, he's awesome. And he just has nothing but great things to say about the book as well. It's just it's really, really good. And it's all, if you're interested in history, it's just like I said, it's like you're reading a really, really long movie about the history of the world. It's amazing. It's really, really cool. So pick it up. Also, if you want to support this ministry, you find value in the kind of things that I do, the videos that I put up, and the content that we produce, then you can head over to our Patreon, patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. Link to that is in the description of this video as well. We've got a bunch of other cool things that you can get there if you support the ministry. Like we've got 12 apologetics courses for beginners. Here's the list. You can pause it and look at all those. You can get all of these for $10 a month over at our Patreon. But I also just wanted to say thank you for watching. If you want to see more of this type of content, consider subscribing. And until next time, I will see you guys later. Remember, Christianity is true.